Tonight I want to bring you a lesson entitled The Loneliness of Jesus. This is number 13 in a series, but don't worry, it's a standalone lesson. You don't have to have studied the other 12 lessons with me, but if you would like to, you know where to find them. And this one, I think, will appear in the next week or two. So you're getting the first chance at it tonight, and I appreciate you being what you are, the guinea pigs. So I'm going to run it past you guys tonight, and if I need to make any changes, you let me know. The loneliness of Jesus. And here we have a painting from, I think, the 1400s, and you'll note that it's pretty obvious. It's Jesus praying in the garden, and when he asked the other three to stay awake and pray with him, they fell asleep. So we want to talk about loneliness and the loneliness of Jesus. And thank you, Dan, for leading. Every song he's led tonight has to do with this lesson. And also our invitation song will also have to do with this lesson. So I appreciate that. So let's talk about solitude for a minute. According to Merriam-Webster.com, solitude is the quality or state of being alone. When you think about being alone, there really are two kinds of solitude. There's isolation in space and isolation of your spirit. So when we talk about isolation in space, we're talking about the fisherman out in his boat by himself in the night fishing, or the mountain climber sitting by himself at the campfire waiting for the next morning to go up the mountain. Well, those don't sound too bad. But what about the man in solitary confinement at the local prison? That sounds a little touchy. So these are people that are isolated in space, either of their own volition or someone has put them in that situation. But what about isolation of the spirit, sometimes called loneliness of the soul? Have you ever been in a crowd that still felt like you were on your own? Have you ever felt that no one cared about you, no one understood you, no one appreciated you? Have you ever shook hands or had someone touch your arm, but you didn't get any warmth out of it? It sent an icy chill of indifference deep into your heart. Eyes gaze into ours, but with a look that cannot read to the bottom of our hearts, to the bottom of our souls. And words pass from our lips, but they come back like an echo of solitude without a reply. So yes, we can be in a crowd and still be lonely. We can still be isolated, because we can be isolated in our heart and in our soul, in our mind. Well, while he was on earth, did Jesus experience either one of these kinds of isolation? Well, yes, he did. He experienced both kinds. But what seemed to touch him the most was isolation of the spirit, where no one seemed to care about, understand, or appreciate what he was doing. Let's talk about the reality of the loneliness of Jesus for a few minutes. If you have your Bibles, let's get them out. We'll turn to Luke chapter 2, and we'll take a rather lengthy reading from that chapter beginning in verse 41. How would you like it if you were on your mission and your parents didn't understand what you're doing? You were on a God-given mission and your parents said, "We don't know what you're doing." Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy, Jesus, stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it. But supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances, and when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. Now, you say, well, how would they have understood? Do you remember what happened before his birth and at his birth? His parents knew that he was sent from God. His parents knew that things were going to happen with this child. They knew that. But, like a lot of us, when the time comes for our kids to start to cut the apron strings, so to speak, we say, what? What's going on here? His parents did not understand his mission. Well, maybe his brothers would be on his side. Well, his brothers, they didn't want any part of him. In John chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, here's what his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For even his brothers would not believe in him. His parents didn't know what he was doing. His brothers, they knew he was doing something, but they really weren't too concerned. And do you notice that they were wanting him to go to the very place where he knew he would probably be killed out of hand? And of course, his time was not there. Well, surely those people down there in his hometown would have been on his side, wouldn't they? Those in his hometown were offended by Jesus. In Mark chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, here's what they had to say to Jesus, about Jesus. "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household." His parents did not understand his mission. His brothers would not support him. The folks at home were offended by him. During his ministry, he was popular for a time. But in the long term, even the people rejected him. Have you thought about the small length of time between the triumphal entry into Jerusalem and they're yelling up, "Crucify him, crucify him"? It was a matter of days. In John 1, verse 11, he came to his own, and his own people would not receive him. And in Matthew 23:37, this is one of the saddest verses. If there's a sadder verse in the New Testament, I'm not sure what it is. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." If anyone tells you Jesus was not lonely, they're wrong. He was as lonely as a person could be. Part of that loneliness, of course, is his lack of acceptance. Why was John the Baptist accepted while Jesus was rejected? You say, wait a minute. Was John the Baptist accepted? He sure was, because he might not have been accepted by the leaders, and we know Herod wasn't happy with him. And if you think Herod wasn't happy with him, Herod's wife he wasn't supposed to have was even less happy with John the Baptist. But generally, in the New Testament, these people that were against John the Baptist would walk lightly around. Why? They would always say, what? The people. The people. John was pretty much accepted. But meanwhile, Jesus was pretty much rejected. Well, why? What did John have going for him that Jesus didn't have going for him? Have you ever thought about that? Let's talk about it for a minute. John the Baptist fit the mold of the religious people of his day. He was under a Nazirite vow. They understood that. He shunned wine and strong drink. This guy must be some kind of religious guy. He stayed out in the wilderness. Okay, yeah. Thus, he was no threat to their positions of power and influence, which didn't happen out in the wilderness. That happened in Jerusalem and in the cities. He fit that mold. And he didn't seem to be that dangerous to them. Well, what about these so-called respectable religious people when it came to Jesus? Well, they shunned him. They shunned Jesus. To Jesus, Jesus that is, to these people, was nothing but a glutton and a wine bibber. Luke 7:34, the Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look at him, he's a glutton and a drunkard. And even worse, he's a friend of who? Sinners. And even worse, he's a friend of who? Tax collectors. Are you kidding me? He's a friend to these people? This guy is supposed to be the guy? This is the Messiah? No. It's amazing then that though he came from humble means, yes, he was the carpenter and the son of the carpenter and the son of Mary and Joseph, but he came from humble means. And what's he claiming? Wait a minute, am I hearing him right? He's claiming to be king of the Jews. John the Baptist never claimed to be king of the Jews. Matter of fact, he spent most of his time saying, no, I am not he, I am his, what we call the forerunner. I am his forerunner. The Pharisees could not comprehend how Jesus could condemn sin and eat with the tax collectors and sinners, as we've just read. To them, his life was totally inconsistent. You might as well say they took him as a hypocrite. It's interesting that the Pharisees took him as a hypocrite, because later on in your Bible study of the Gospels, who was Jesus talking about when he started raising his voice and say, you hypocrites? The Pharisees. His lack of acceptance is obviously part of the reason for his loneliness. And we go back now to our painting, and we talk about the loneliness of Jesus in the garden. You say, well, he wasn't alone. He had these other three guys. Did he? In Gethsemane, we understand what Isaiah 53:3 says. We read that passage almost every Sunday, not every Sunday, but almost every Sunday. And we understand what that means when we see him alone in the garden. He was a man of sorrows. He was acquainted with grief. In Gethsemane, he prayed 3 times. 3 times in the garden he prayed. Each time he went to his disciples looking for some human sympathy and some encouragement, some spiritual uplifting. And when he got to them for that, when he went to them for that, what were they doing? Sleeping. Can you imagine that? I mean, I'm just the guest preacher, but none of y'all are sleeping. right this minute. It's still early in the talk. But can you imagine? Go with me a little ways and watch with me for a little while. He'd already told him the end was near. Of course, we understand. They didn't understand. Let's go to Luke 22, verse 39. And we notice that on that third time, he doesn't really lambaste them. He actually rebukes them in a fairly kind way because he realized they were sleeping from sorrow. And of course, we all understand how that works as well. And he came out and he went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples, and he found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." This last time that he came to his disciples and found them sleeping, you can see this in Matthew 26:45, which we just read a few weeks ago in our Bible reading that we're doing before services. When he came to him that last time, he pretty much told him to just sleep on. Just sleep on. Why? Why did he give up? He went one time, said, "Wake up and..." He went another time, "Wake up and pray." And he went the third time, and he said, just sleep on. Well, because I would say two things. Number one, I would say it was no longer possible for them to be of any help. They had missed their opportunity to do what they could have done to relieve some of this loneliness that he experienced in the garden. That's one. And the second thing is the hour of watching and praying had passed, and they slept through it, and the enemy was at hand. Judas and the crowd were on their way, and within perhaps minutes he would be betrayed and taken to court. What about the loneliness of Jesus when he is forsaken by the apostles? John 16:32, "Behold, the hour is coming, indeed it has come, when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me" where? Alone. You'll leave me alone. Yet I am not alone. Yet I am not alone, because who? The Father is with me. The Father is with me. I'm not alone. Have you ever thought about the reasons the apostles should not have forsaken Jesus? We know they were scared. That's probably the main reason that they forsook him. And you say, well, they were willing to fight, but then Jesus said, "We're not going to fight." So they may have decided we better run. If we're not going to fight, we better run. It's amazing, though, that they had forsaken Jesus, but they had already forsaken all they had to follow Jesus. All the fishermen had left their nets and come after Jesus. Matthew, the tax collector, had left his tax table and come after Jesus. They forsook him, though they had forsaken all to follow him. Matthew 19:27. In John 11, verses 1 through 16, we see there was a time when they had been ready and willing to die with Jesus. Let's go down there and we'll all die. I can't remember who said it. Either Thomas or Philip said that. We'll just all go down there and die. They forsook him, though they had been ready and willing to die with him, John 11. What about Matthew 26:33? They forsook him, even though they stated, "We never will." A lot of times we put that on Peter, but he might have been the spokesperson there, but it's pretty much all of them made that statement. And I already gave this one away, the last one. They forsook him, though they were willing to strike out at those who had arrested him. At least we know Peter was willing, because he had the sword. John 18:10. So here's Jesus. Here comes Judas Iscariot. He's betrayed. Here comes these soldiers, this crowd, and they're about to take him. And his apostles head for the hills, except for two. Peter, we know, followed at a distance. And there's one more that went a little closer. Sometimes we forget about that. Do you remember who went a little closer? Who was friends with somebody in the court? The disciple whom Jesus loved, which we believe is John. But the rest of them, we have no idea where they went. So, he was alone when he was forsaken by the apostles. Do you suppose, even though he was not alone in space, he was not isolated in space, do you believe he was isolated in spirit when he came to those false trials? He's alone in judgment. He was illegally condemned by the Jewish council. It was during these trials that Peter had followed afar off. And meanwhile, now when we say afar off, that's somewhat tricky, because he was in line of sight with Jesus. Do you understand that? Peter was in line of sight with Jesus. Listen, let's turn to Luke 22:54 through 62. Then they seized Jesus and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house, and Peter following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, "This man was also with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man was also with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you're talking about." Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. Do you remember what Jesus had predicted? He said, before the rooster crows twice, Old King James, "Thou shalt deny me thrice." 3 times. Now listen to this. Immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter, remembering the saying of the Lord, how he had said, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and he wept bitterly. Jesus was never more alone than when he looked at Peter after that 3rd denial. He was as alone as he could be. This turns out to be a rhetorical question, doesn't it? Could Jesus have been any more alone? He could not have been. Even though he was in the midst of all these soldiers, all these members of the council, the high priest, yet he was alone. What kept the Jews from just killing him right on the spot. We know. We studied it. We know what it was. Rome did not allow the Jews to execute criminals. They were going to have to get somebody else to do it, namely the Roman government, so they send him on to Pontius Pilate. Who stood with him as he stood before Pontius Pilate? He stood alone, didn't he? Jesus stood alone as Pilate determined whether he should live, as the crowd continued to shout in John 19:15, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Remember when some people determined that washing your hands during COVID was worthless? And perhaps it was, or perhaps it wasn't. But I can tell you one time in history when washing your hands was worthless. It meant nothing and did nothing. Can you tell me? Do you know when someone washed their hands and thought they were clear and free of the matter? But they were not clear and free of the matter. Though Pilate washed his hands, he delivered Jesus to be crucified. Jesus was alone in judgment before the Jews. He was alone in judgment before the Roman governor. Jesus wasn't through being alone, though, was he? He had somewhere else he had to go to be alone. Jesus suffered the loneliness of the cross. He was forsaken by every man, and he faced his cross alone. It is sad to die, but the one who dies alone is to be genuinely pitied. While on the cross, Jesus even cried out in Matthew 27:46, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus had a lot of alone time, didn't he? If you hadn't thought about all these things this evening, all in one 25-minute think time, we've had time tonight to think about all the time he was either alone in space or he was alone in spirit. He's the Son of God. Did he have to be alone? Couldn't he have taken these matters into his own hand? Who am I starting to sound like here? I'm starting to sound like the Jews walking by the cross and looking up and mocking Jesus. Are you the Son of God? Come on down here. Get on down off that cross. How was Jesus motivated? That's how we have to think for just a few minutes. What was his motivation? How could Jesus go on facing such rejection and loneliness? Well, guess what? We've already read John 16:32, but we are going to read it one more time. "Behold, the hour is coming, indeed it has come, when you will be scattered," he told the disciples, "each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me." Did Jesus come to earth to be accepted? He came to earth and allowed people to either accept him or reject him. Why? Well, because acceptance was not his focus. He came to do the Father's will. That was his focus. John 6:38. He did not seek acceptance or popularity on anyone else's terms. Only on the terms of his Father in heaven. Jesus realized the worth or merit of his life depended on his relationship with his Father and not the feelings or opinions of others. Jesus understood that being alone was not harmful when that loneliness was caused by standing for the truth. What is our blessed assurance in our loneliness? Well, number one, I will tell you, the Christian is never alone. May seem like it. Has anybody been at work and you're like the only one there that's trying to stand for the right? We've heard Alan tell stories of that. I've told stories of being, in the faculty lounge and, well, here we go. We've all had that situation, but we are never alone. Just like the Lord was always, his Father was always with the Lord and the Father and the Holy Spirit are always with us. The Lord is with us. Listen to Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6. Hebrew writer says, "Keep your life free from love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you." So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? One of the reasons God has given us the local church is that no matter how isolated we feel in the world, we have those who are concerned about us. Just don't show up here for a couple of weeks. And don't text anybody, don't email anybody. Just don't show up here for a couple of weeks. See if you don't get people coming to get you, coming to find you, getting a hold of you one way or another. We have people here that are concerned about us. We have people that understand us. They appreciate us and they freely share themselves and their lives with us. That's what we have in the local church. That's why we call it the church family. That's why we call it the family of God. Christian is never alone. The Lord is with us. Secondly, we have to realize our self-worth does not depend upon the opinions of others, but just like Jesus, it depends on our relationship with the Father in heaven. Standing for the truth and right will place you in the company of the finest people who've ever lived, including Jesus Christ at the top of that list. Let's have just a couple of closing thoughts and then the lesson will be yours. Did you ever stop and think about what you would have done concerning the loneliness of Jesus? Because it wasn't just the 12 apostles following around with Jesus. We know there were lots of women following around. From what I can understand, they're the ones that were paying for everything. Or a lot of it. Seeing to those daily needs. There were a lot of people around. You could have been around. You could have been around if you would have been there. You say, but I'm a woman. No, you could have been around. Every time they make it toward the end, they don't say, hey, look who was here. They don't say, look who was here. Here's Peter and here's so-and-so and so-and-so. They start naming off about 17 different Marys. Don't they? Not 17, but 3 or 4. 3, perhaps 4 different Marys. And of course, John was there. We got to keep giving it to John. He was there. But then it was Mary and Mary and Mary. That's who was there. We could have been there. If we were alive, we could have been, and we lived in that area, we could have been there. So do you ever stop and think about what you would have done when you saw Jesus in his loneliness as he faced the cross? When the going got tough, what would you have done? You would have got going, probably. I would have probably got going. When I saw the naked guy running, I would have been right behind him. Remember that? Guy was running, and by naked we mean he didn't have his outer garments on. But when that guy took off running, I probably would have been right behind him. Would I have forsaken Jesus and fled? I say, would you have forsaken him and fled? But remember, I'm saying us, me, you, me, us. Would we have forsaken Jesus and fled? You can know what you would have done then by what you are doing now. Let that sink in. Are you willing to be his friend? And are you willing to stand beside him? These are things that we have to think about every day. And that brings us to the close of our lesson. And we'll stop the video right here.